He hadn't spoken to another human in months, and hadn't planned to. But when he opened his cabin door that night and saw a bleeding bear collapse in the snow, everything changed. He could have shut the door. He didn't. What followed wasn't friendship. It was something quieter, and far more human. The mountains had gone quiet days ago. No wind, no birds, just a silence thick enough to weigh on a man's chest. Inside a weather-worn cabin, Samuel turned the log in his stove with a poker and watched it split open, releasing a dull orange glow. He hadn't spoken in weeks. There was no one to speak to. The radio had stopped catching a signal after the last storm, and even his own voice felt foreign when he muttered to himself. He'd come here for solitude, not ghosts. The world below, its noise, its people, its unfinished conversations, had taken too much from him. Up here he thought he could start over, one day at a time, chopping wood, melting snow for water, writing a few words in a notebook he never reread. Outside the storm began again. It started as a whisper, wind against pine, then grew into a full-bodied roar. Samuel set down his pen and listened. The sound of snow hitting the roof felt heavier than before. He stepped to the small window and saw nothing but white. Then a thud. Soft at first, then louder. Like something collapsing into the snow just beyond his porch. He froze. The instinct of a man alone in the wilderness. Don't move until you know what it is. He reached for the old rifle hanging by the door but didn't lift it yet. Through the frosted glass he could make out a dark shape on the ground. Too large to be a deer, too still to be a wolf. He wiped the window with his sleeve. The shape moved. And even through the storm he saw the unmistakable outline, the hump of the shoulders, the wide muzzle, the heavy paws. A bear. For a second his breath caught. He'd seen tracks before, scratched bark, even fur caught on tree trunks, but never one this close. He considered firing a warning shot. Then the shape lifted its head and he saw blood in the snow. It wasn't charging. It was struggling to breathe. Samuel hesitated at the door. He could stay inside. Let nature handle what nature began. But then, a sound he didn't expect. A low, broken exhale. Not a growl. A sound that wasn't aggression but exhaustion. Bang. He lowered the rifle. Minutes passed before he moved. He pulled on his coat, took his lantern and stepped outside. The wind bit through the seams of his gloves. The bear's fur was dark with melting snow and streaked red near its shoulder. Samuel crouched a few feet away, light trembling in his hand. The bear's eyes followed him, not with fear, not even warning, just a dull awareness as if both knew that this meeting shouldn't be happening, yet here they were. Samuel didn't know what to do. He had no medicine strong enough for a wild creature, no training. He could leave food, maybe water. Then retreat. He set the lantern on the snow and backed toward the cabin, muttering, "You'll have to figure this out yourself." But when he turned, the bear made a sound again, softer this time, more like a breath than a growl. Something in that sound stopped him. Inside the cabin, the fire hissed as snow blew through the open door. Samuel shut it, paced once, twice. He poured hot water into a tin bowl and looked back at the window. The bear's shadow hadn't moved. He told himself he'd only check once more, just to see if it was still alive when the storm ended. Nothing more. But when he opened the door again, the bear lifted its head, barely, as if acknowledging him. He set the bowl a few feet away and stepped back, watching steam rise into the cold. For a long while neither of them moved. The snow kept falling, muting everything. And for the first time since Samuel came to the mountains, he didn't feel entirely alone. Still, he whispered to himself, "Don't get used to this." That night, he heard footsteps circling his cabin. Slow, heavy, deliberate, and when he looked through the window the lantern outside had gone dark. If you were Samuel, alone in that cabin hearing those footsteps, would you open the door again or let nature take its course? When Samuel opened his eyes, the fire had gone out. The silence was heavier than usual, like the air itself was waiting. He pulled on his coat and unlatched the window. The storm had passed. Everything outside was buried under a smooth, untouched layer of snow, except for one thing. Tracks. They started at the porch and circled the cabin twice, wide and deliberate. Then they stopped near the woodpile. No blood this time. Just the clean imprint of paws. He stepped outside slowly, the boards creaking under his boots. The bowl he'd left for the bear was gone, dragged a few feet away, now half buried. The snow was disturbed, as if something heavy had lain there through the night. Samuel scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. But there was a strange calm in the air. No threat, no chaos, just the sense of being watched. He thought of the way the bear had looked at him before collapsing. Eyes neither wild nor tame, just aware. Maybe it had survived the night. Maybe it had left. Still, the fact it had circled the cabin instead of wandering off gnawed at him. What? He set fresh logs by the door and started a new fire. He told himself he wouldn't step outside again tonight. He'd done enough. But when dusk came, he noticed something through the window, a faint shape between the trees. The same outline he'd seen before, only now standing, not fallen. The bear. It didn't move closer. It just stood there, breathing, steam rising from its muzzle. Watching. Samuel's hand rested on the doorframe. He could hear his heartbeat echoing in his ears. He didn't know what the bear wanted. But something in that stillness felt less like a threat and more like expectation. Maybe the bear wasn't there to take. Maybe it was waiting. He lit the lantern again and set it near the doorway just as he had the night before. But this time he didn't go back inside. He sat on the porch steps, the light flickering between them, snow falling quietly. Minutes turned into an hour. The bear didn't approach. It didn't leave either. It simply stayed, breathing, watching, alive. And somehow Samuel felt something unfamiliar, relief. As if both of them, in their silence, had agreed to something neither could explain. In the morning the bear was gone, but on the porch lay something new, a freshly caught fish placed carefully beside the lantern. The next morning, a thin fog hovered low over the field, curling around the stalks of golden wheat like whispered secrets. Ravi stepped onto his porch with a cautious optimism, heart still racing from yesterday's revelation of the cub's footprints. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and soil, and the distant rustle of the forest hinted that the bear had arrived. Sure enough, at the field's edge, the massive brown figure emerged, moving with deliberate care. Behind it, almost hidden by the tall stalks, a smaller shadow followed, a cub no more than a few months old. Its fur, a lighter shade of brown, shimmered with dew, and its movements were tentative, curious, yet hesitant. Ravi's breath caught. For the first time he witnessed not just the protective adult bear, but the delicate dependency of its young. He remained still, remembering the lessons of the previous day. Any sudden movement could alarm the animals, destroying the fragile trust that had formed. Slowly he retrieved a small notebook, jotting down observations. Paw size, gait, how the cub mimicked the adult's movements. Every detail mattered. The cub paused near a patch of disturbed wheat, sniffing curiously at the golden stalks. Its mother, or guardian, stood alert, glancing back toward the forest as if ensuring safety. Ravi realized the complexity of this dynamic. The cub was learning, observing, and absorbing the behaviors necessary for survival. The adult bear's measured restraint was a lesson in coexistence, and the cub was the silent student. As he watched, a sudden gust of wind swept through the valley, bending the wheat like waves on a golden sea. The cub froze, ears twitching, eyes wide with uncertainty. The mother bear shifted slightly, moving between the cub and the edge of the forest, an instinctual barrier. Ravi's heart ached with empathy. He understood that fear and protection were intertwined in these creatures, just as they were in humans. Ravi made a conscious decision. He would not interfere. Instead, he chose observation, patience, and respect. Yet, instinctively, he reached into his coat pocket and drew a small piece of fruit he had kept from breakfast, a humble offering not to feed but to signal harmlessness. He placed it gently on the porch railing, in full view but at a safe distance, and stepped back. The cub's nose twitched as it caught the scent. It stepped cautiously toward the edge of the field, pausing at intervals to glance at its guardian. The adult bear remained vigilant, yet did not obstruct the cub's exploration. Slowly the cub approached the fruit, sniffing it, then nudging it lightly with its nose. Ravi held his breath. The moment was fragile, a perfect balance of curiosity and caution. The cub's small paw tapped the fruit once, twice, then it retreated, glancing back at its guardian. Ravi smiled quietly, heart swelling with a mixture of relief and wonder. The tiny act, so simple yet profound, marked the first connection between human and animal. He understood the moral clearly. Respect and patience could bridge worlds, and understanding was a language beyond words. By midday, villagers had started whispering again. Some were captivated by the scene, while others warned Ravi of danger. But as he observed, he realized something extraordinary. The adult bear and cub were not just surviving. They were teaching him patience, respect, and a new perspective on coexistence. Each movement, each pause, each careful glance was a lesson. As the sun began its descent, the bears retreated toward the forest, the cub lingering briefly near the edge of the wheat before following its guardian. Ravi felt a mixture of awe and anxiety. Tomorrow the cub might grow bolder, or the adult bear might alter its patrol. The delicate rhythm of trust was still being written, and he was only a silent participant. That night, Ravi sat by the small fire inside his modest cabin, thinking about the day. The lesson was clear. Patience, observation and respect created bonds stronger than fear. The cub's tentative trust, mirrored by the adult's protective restraint, offered hope. Yet, he could not shake the sense that this was only the beginning, a beginning that might test his understanding and courage in ways he could not yet predict. Will the cub come closer tomorrow, and can Ravi maintain this fragile trust without breaking the balance between curiosity and caution? The bear was closer than it had ever been. When Samuel opened the door that evening, the cold hit him first, then the silence. Just a few feet away at the edge of the porch light, the bear stood motionless. Its breath rose in slow, steady plumes, the faint orange glow of the lantern catching in its eyes. Samuel's pulse hammered. He gripped the doorframe, torn between instinct and something deeper that told him not to move too fast, not to turn away. The bear didn't growl, didn't advance. It simply stood, watching, waiting. He realized for the first time that the bear's wound had nearly healed. The fur along its shoulder was matted but no longer red. It looked stronger now, steadier. It had survived the storm, and somehow, it had chosen to return here. Samuel stepped forward just once. The snow creaked under his boot. The bear's head tilted, muscles tensing, but it didn't retreat. "I won't hurt you," Samuel said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. It sounded strange in the air, like it didn't belong to him anymore. He set a bowl on the snow between them and stepped back, slow and deliberate. The bear's eyes followed his every move. It sniffed the air once, twice, then approached, cautious but confident. For a moment, both shared the same circle of light, the same breath of cold night air. The bear lowered its head, took what it needed and lifted its gaze again, not at the food but at Samuel. That look lingered, long enough to feel like understanding. He whispered, "You're not supposed to be here," though a part of him knew he was no longer talking to the bear alone. He was talking to himself, the man who had come here to be alone, yet found company in the last place he'd ever imagined. The bear turned and walked toward the trees, snow crunching softly beneath its paws. Before disappearing into the shadows, it stopped once more and looked back. Then, as quietly as it had come, it was gone. Samuel stood there long after, staring into the dark. He didn't feel fear anymore, just a strange ache like something had ended before it even began. Inside he wrote again in his notebook. "Shared the night with a bear. Neither of us spoke. Both understood." That line stayed with him. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full, of breath, of warmth, of something unspoken that refused to vanish with the dawn. Days later, a storm returned. But this time, when Samuel looked out the window, he saw two shapes in the snow instead of one. The bear had come back, and this time it wasn't alone. The storm roared again 3 nights later. Snow lashed against the windows, the kind that erases every path, every track. Samuel hadn't seen the bear for a week. He'd almost convinced himself that the strange companionship had ended the way most wild things end, suddenly without reason. But near midnight a sound cut through the wind. A thump. Then another. Not frantic, deliberate. He grabbed his lantern and stepped to the door, expecting emptiness. Instead, his light caught 2 shadows moving against the white. One large, one smaller. The bear was back and beside her a cub. For a moment Samuel forgot to breathe. The cub stayed close to her leg, barely more than a bundle of fur and tremors. Its steps were uneven, its head low. He realized it wasn't play, it was struggle. The cub was weak. The mother bear watched him the way she had before, still, steady, unafraid. The storm whipped between them, but neither moved. Samuel looked down at the bowl he had once filled for her. Without thinking he went inside, ladled warm broth into it and placed it on the porch. The mother didn't advance. She only glanced toward it once, then looked back at him, eyes reflecting the light like twin embers. It hit him slowly, she wasn't there for food. She was there because she remembered what he'd done before. The cub whimpered, barely audible under the storm. Samuel's heart tightened. Every instinct told him not to step closer. This was still a wild animal and that cub was her world. But doing nothing felt unbearable. He dragged an old blanket to the porch and left it beside the wall, then retreated inside. The bears didn't move. They stood there, snow piling on their backs as if waiting for his permission to stay. Hours passed. The storm softened. When Samuel opened the door at dawn, both bears were gone, but near the steps lay the blanket, shredded slightly at the edge. In its center, something rested, a pine cone stripped neatly of seeds. He stared at it, a quiet laugh escaping him. A gift, he whispered, though he wasn't sure for whom. For the rest of the morning, he couldn't shake the thought that the mother had brought her cub here because she trusted him. Because somewhere between silence and survival, a wordless agreement had formed. That night, Samuel heard movement again, heavier, slower this time. When he looked outside, the mother was gone, but the cub was curled against his porch, shivering and alone. Would you have stepped out to help the cub, knowing its mother might return at any moment? The wind had died, but the cold was sharper now, the kind that burns before it numbs. Samuel stood by the door, staring at the small, shivering shape huddled on his porch. The cub was barely breathing, its fur crusted with frost. He waited, half expecting the mother to emerge from the trees, to reclaim what was hers. But the woods remained silent, heavy with snow. Samuel's breath trembled. Every rational thought screamed, stay inside. A wild animal was still a wild animal, and if the mother returned to find him too close. But another thought rose, quieter, steadier. If I do nothing, it'll die. He wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and stepped out, slow, deliberate. The boards creaked beneath his boots. The cub didn't move, didn't even look up. He crouched at a distance, studying it, ribs faintly visible beneath fur, one paw slightly twisted. The lantern light flickered across the cub's face. Its eyes opened, dull but aware. It's all right, Samuel murmured, as though the words mattered. Maybe they were more for him than for it. He set the blanket beside it, not daring to touch. The cub's breath was shallow but steadying. He slid the bowl of warm broth closer, inch by inch, until the scent reached it. The cub sniffed weakly, then began to lick the surface, slow and uncertain. Samuel exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening just enough to feel the cold again. Minutes passed. The world outside the lantern's glow didn't move. The forest seemed to be holding its breath. Finally, the cub finished, let out a small sound, not a growl, not fear. Just exhaustion. It curled into the blanket, and for the first time that winter, Samuel opened the door wide and left it ajar. The heat from inside spilled into the night, and the cub inched closer, drawn by warmth. He didn't call it in. Didn't coax it. He simply sat near the doorway until his eyes grew heavy and the fire dimmed. When he woke before dawn, the cub was gone. Only the blanket remained, damp, half-dragged toward the trees. He smiled faintly, almost proud, and whispered into the empty morning, "You made it through the night." Then quieter still. "So did I." Later that day, Samuel found new tracks, 2 sets again, smaller now but strong. The mother had returned. And this time, the tracks circled the cabin only once, before leading back into the forest, leaving a single fish by the steps. The next morning arrived quietly. The snow had eased, leaving the world drenched in pale blue light. The ranger woke up stiff but alive. He turned his head, and found the bear still there, sitting beside the door like a guardian carved from ice. Steam rose from the pot he'd left on the stove. The bear's breath made small clouds in the air. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't fearful either. Simply was. He stood, reached for his kettle, and poured the last of his tea. The bear's head tilted, watching every motion. The ranger muttered softly, "Guess you're staying then." He said it not as a question but as a fact. There was a strange peace in the air, an unspoken agreement between 2 survivors of the same storm. He took a slice of old bread and tossed it gently toward the floor. The bear didn't lunge, it just sniffed, nudged it, and left it there. Then, after a pause, it turned its heavy head toward the fire. That moment told him everything. The bear didn't come for food. It came for warmth. For life. He sat back down, eyes resting on the flickering flames. "We both got tired of the cold out there, didn't we?" he whispered. The bear blinked slowly, then lowered itself beside the wall, fur melting into shadow. Outside, the forest exhaled, a sigh of thaw and silence. Hours passed. He repaired his traps, whittled a stick, and pretended not to notice that a 600-pound animal was sharing his cabin. But something changed in the air. The fear that had wrapped around him for days lifted. He realized it wasn't just the storm he'd been hiding from. It was loneliness. Every day in that cabin, he spoke only to the creak of wood and the sigh of wind. The bear's quiet presence broke that silence in a way no human voice could. He thought of the men at the station, the ones who'd laugh if they knew. They'd call him crazy for letting a wild thing so close. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel crazy. He felt seen. As the day dimmed, the bear stirred again. It rose, shook the snow from its fur, and turned toward the door. The ranger hesitated, hand resting on the latch. He wanted to stop it, but knew he couldn't. When he opened the door, a rush of cold air swept in, carrying pine and frost. The bear paused on the threshold, turned its head, and for a heartbeat their eyes met. There was no fear. No gratitude. Just understanding. Then it walked into the snow, slow and deliberate, disappearing into the trees. The ranger stood there long after it was gone, his breath clouding in the pale air. He didn't move until the forest swallowed the last trace of it. That night he didn't light the fire immediately. The cabin felt colder, emptier, but not lonely. He looked toward the door and smiled faintly. "See you when the snow returns," he murmured. And outside, deep in the dark woods, something heavy moved through the snow, leaving a trail that circled once, then vanished into silence. Winter loosened its grip on the forest, slowly giving way to the kind of thaw that made the ground steam by morning. The ranger stayed in his cabin through it all, chopping wood, mending fences, and marking the passing of days with scratches on the doorframe. The bear had been gone for months. Sometimes, when the wind moved through the pines just right, he could almost hear the creature's heavy breath beyond the ridge. But he told himself it was only wind, because hope, he knew, was more dangerous than solitude. Still, each morning he placed a scrap of bread on the same spot near the fire, half smiling at his own foolishness. "You don't wait for wild things," he'd mutter. "They owe you nothing." But something deep inside him, something primal and wordless, waited anyway. When spring came, the forest was no longer silent. The river thawed, roaring down from the mountains. Tracks of deer, fox, and rabbit reappeared near his cabin. The world felt alive again, but in its music he heard absence. One morning he woke to find his cabin door ajar. Not forced open, just gently moved as if nudged by the wind. He froze, listening. There was no sound, only a faint scent of wet fur and pine. He stepped outside, eyes scanning the soft earth, and there they were. Footprints. Not human. Not deer. Broad, deep impressions leading from the tree line straight to his porch. His heart slammed against his ribs. He followed the tracks a few paces before stopping himself. Every instinct said don't. But instinct also whispered another truth, that fear wasn't always a warning. Sometimes it was memory trying to protect a heart that had already changed. He crouched down beside one of the prints, brushing the edge with his hand. The soil was still damp. Hours old, maybe less. That meant the bear had been here, watching, waiting, just as quietly as before. He didn't light his lantern that night. Instead, he sat by the fire in the dark, the way he had that stormy night months ago. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a low voice, and at times he thought he could hear the crunch of something heavy circling just beyond sight. When he finally drifted to sleep, it was not out of fear, but peace. Morning came with a sound he hadn't heard since autumn, a low, muffled groan from the forest's edge. He opened the door and saw it, the bear. Thinner now, its fur darker from rain and mud, but unmistakably the same. And beside it, something smaller. A cub. The ranger froze, the world narrowing to that one scene. A mother bear standing just beyond the clearing, and beside her, a wobbling shape barely reaching her shoulder. She looked at him the same way she had before, steady, unblinking, without malice. The cub, curious, took a few clumsy steps toward him before the mother extended a paw to stop it. He understood immediately, the bear wasn't alone because she couldn't be. Without thinking, he stepped back into the cabin, grabbed the stale bread he'd left out, and tossed it gently onto the snow. The cub sniffed, blinked, and, against its mother's hesitation, waddled forward to take it. The ranger didn't move, hardly breathed. The cub sniffed again, grabbed the bread awkwardly, and retreated, falling over itself in the process. For the first time he laughed. Not loud, not forced, just an honest, small sound. The mother bear blinked once, slow and deliberate. Then, with the kind of grace only wild things carry, she turned, nudging her cub toward the woods. The ranger watched them go until the forest swallowed their shapes. He thought that was the end. He was wrong. 2 nights later, he woke to the sound of growling, not near but close enough to make his skin prickle. He reached for his rifle, then hesitated. The sound wasn't from the bear, it was sharper, higher-pitched. Coyotes. He rushed outside, the cold biting his face. The moonlight revealed movement near the tree-line, the cub, cornered, surrounded by a pack. Without thinking, he fired a shot into the air. The crack shattered the silence. The coyotes scattered, vanishing into the black. The cub trembled but didn't run. Then came another sound, deep, thunderous, and terrifying. The mother bear burst from the trees like a storm breaking open the night. She reached her cub, sniffed it all over, then turned her head toward the ranger. For a long moment they stood there, man and beast, each lit by the dying moon. There was something in her eyes he couldn't name, not gratitude, not recognition. Something beyond either. Then she let out a low rumble, not of threat but of finality, and guided her cub back into the woods. The ranger lowered his rifle. His hands shook not from fear but from awe. He whispered into the quiet, "Go on. This place was never mine alone." When dawn broke, he walked out again to where they had stood. The snow was torn and trampled, the footprints leading toward the mountains. He followed them for a while until the prints thinned and vanished into stone. He stood there watching the horizon where forest met sky. For the first time in years he didn't feel small. He didn't feel alone. He felt like part of something that didn't need words, didn't need names, only understanding. He turned back toward his cabin, knowing the forest had changed him in ways no man could ever undo. That night, as he stirred the fire one last time, he glanced toward the window. The sky was clear, the kind of clarity that made stars look close enough to touch. And just beyond the glass, faint in the moonlight, he saw them again, two shapes watching from the ridge. The mother. The cub. Both still, silent, their eyes catching the firelight from inside his home. He didn't move. He just breathed, and in that breath, something unspoken passed between them. Then as quickly as they'd appeared, they turned and slipped back into the dark. Would you have stepped outside that night, or stayed behind the door pretending not to hear the cries? The next morning, the ranger finds something outside his door, a gift he never expected, left in the snow where the bear had stood. The morning light crept across the cabin floor, soft and golden, melting away the night's frost. The ranger stirred from uneasy sleep, his mind still tangled in the echo of last night's sounds, the cry of the cub, the gunshot, the rumble of the mother bear. He sat up, rubbed the cold from his eyes, and noticed something strange. The cabin felt different. Not empty, not tense, just waiting. He walked toward the door and unlatched it slowly. The air outside was crisp, the world painted in that fragile silence only morning brings. He took one step onto the porch, then froze. There, in the snow, lay something small. A single fish. Not freshly caught, but frozen, carried from the river and placed carefully at the edge of his doorstep. His breath caught. He looked around, no sign of the bear, no sound but wind brushing through pines. But he didn't need to see her. He knew. He crouched down, studying it. It wasn't the fish itself that mattered, it was what it meant. Animals didn't do favors. They didn't trade. They survived. Yet here it was, a gesture impossible to explain in words, undeniable in its intent. A silent acknowledgement. He whispered, barely audible, "You came back." He picked up the fish, holding it in both hands. For the first time in years he felt something rise in his chest, something he hadn't let himself feel since his wife died, since he'd buried his son's wooden toy near the cabin door. Connection. The forest had been his punishment, his solitude, now it felt like forgiveness. He carried the fish to the river, the same place he'd once trapped and hunted. He knelt at the edge, let the icy water flow through his fingers and placed the fish back in. It drifted downstream, a quiet offering to the same current that had once taken so much from him. When he looked up, movement caught his eye, a shadow between the trees. The bear stood there again, the cub nestled against her side. They watched each other for what felt like hours. No sound, no movement, just two species bound not by ownership or fear but by shared recognition. Finally he raised his hand, slow, deliberate, and lowered it again. A gesture of peace. The bear blinked, exhaled a cloud of vapor, and turned away, guiding her cub deeper into the trees. He didn't follow this time. He didn't need to. Some bonds don't require proximity, they exist in the knowing. Days turned to weeks. Spring blossomed fully now, rivers wide, trees loud with birds. The ranger found traces of them sometimes. Overturned stones near the stream, fur snagged on bark, prints pressed deep into the earth. Each sign reminded him of something sacred, that even the wild could remember kindness. He stopped setting traps entirely. He began planting small patches of greens near the treeline, not for himself but for whatever might need them. He even started carving again, shaping small figures of wood, a bear, a cub, a man by the fire. He'd placed them on the windowsill, a silent story told to no one but the trees. One night, rain returned, tapping gently on the roof. He sat near the fire with a book in hand, though his eyes barely moved across the pages. Every crackle of the wood made him glance toward the window, half expecting to see movement in the dark. But the forest stayed quiet. He smiled faintly and whispered, "You're smarter than me, you know that? You knew when to leave." He poured himself tea, leaned back and let his eyelids droop. Then, a sound. A faint scratching against the wood. Not claws against bark. Not the creak of branches. Closer. At the door. He froze, pulse quickening. Slowly he set the cup down, reached for his lantern and opened the door. Rain misted his face and there it was again, those same broad prints leading from the forest to his porch. But this time they weren't alone. Alongside them were smaller, lighter impressions, human boots. Fresh. He looked around, lantern swinging in the rain. Someone had been here. Recently. And beside the prints, something else, a scrap of cloth snagged on the corner of his fence. Torn, muddy, and smelling faintly of smoke. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. The nearest settlement was 20 miles away. No one came this far unless they were desperate, or running from something. He turned his lantern toward the treeline and for just a heartbeat, he saw it. 2 eyes shining in the dark, too low to be human, too steady to be fear. The bear was there. Watching. And then, behind her, another flicker of light. A second lantern. Someone else was out there. He lowered his own light instinctively, the night closing in like a held breath. The bear didn't move, she stood guard between him and the unknown glow behind her. The ranger took a cautious step forward. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady but low. No answer. Only rain. Then the second light went out. Darkness swallowed the woods. The bear turned her head slightly toward him, then back toward the trees as if torn between staying and going. And in that moment the ranger realized something chilling. She wasn't guarding him from danger. She was guarding him and her cub from the same thing. Whatever was out there, neither of them trusted it. He stood still, the rain soaking through his coat. The forest around him had changed, its silence no longer peaceful but watchful. The air carried tension, the kind that made your skin remember every old scar. The bear took one slow step backward, eyes never leaving the dark. The ranger whispered, "Not tonight, friend. Not tonight." But even as he spoke, a branch cracked somewhere deep in the forest. Then another. Heavy footsteps. Human. And then the distant flicker of a third light. He turned toward the bear, but she and the cub were already gone, vanished into the trees. The ranger raised his lantern again, its flame trembling in the rain. The tracks in the snow now led both ways, toward the woods and away from them. He looked down at the wet ground and saw it, another footprint beside his. Smaller. Human. Fresh. And beside it, blood. As lightning flashed, he saw something lying near the fence, a human backpack torn open, and inside it something that didn't belong to any human. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the clearing for one brief, trembling instant. The ranger's breath caught as his eyes fixed on the torn backpack lying half buried in mud near the fence. Rain slicked the straps, glinting faintly in the flash before darkness swallowed it again. He lowered his lantern and stepped closer. Every instinct screamed caution, but curiosity and dread drove him forward. When he reached it, he knelt, fingers brushing against the soaked canvas. The smell of iron and wet leather filled the air. He unzipped it slowly. Inside lay a small hunting knife, a soaked map, and a pouch of raw meat. The ranger's pulse quickened. He lifted the pouch, heavy, dripping, and realized the meat was fresh. Cut clean. Too clean. It wasn't for human food. It was bait. He looked toward the woods, his throat tightening. The tracks, the blood, the torn cloth, it all connected now. Someone had come here to hunt. And not deer. A low rumble rolled through the trees, the kind that vibrated through the ribs more than the ears. The bear. The ranger's hand tightened around the lantern. He turned slowly toward the sound, the dim flame revealing nothing but swirling rain and the skeletal outlines of trees. Yet he could feel her presence, not far, just beyond the edge of vision. Then faintly the other sound returned, footsteps. Human stumbling, panicked. "Damn it!" A man's voice hissed in the dark, followed by a sharp metallic click, the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked. The ranger's body froze. He shouted into the black, "Who's out there?" No answer. Just movement. Then a single flash, muzzle fire. The bullet whistled past him, punching through the wood of the fence. He ducked, lantern swinging wildly. He ran for the cabin, heart pounding. Inside, he grabbed his old rifle from the wall. He hadn't used it in years. His hands shook as he loaded the chamber, not from fear of death, but from the understanding of what was about to happen. Another shot cracked the air, this time closer. The sound of shattering glass filled the cabin. His window blown open. He fell behind the table, breath ragged. Outside, something enormous growled, the kind of sound that made the forest itself hold still. The hunter fired again. Then came a scream. A short, sharp cry, human, cut off almost instantly by a sound like thunder meeting flesh. Then, silence. The rain slowed to a mist. He waited, rifle tight against his chest, listening. Nothing. Not a breath, not a step. Only the faint hiss of water dripping from the roof. Finally, he stood and stepped toward the shattered window. The clearing lay quiet under the pale flash of distant lightning. And there, near the fence, was the hunter lying motionless, his rifle flung aside. The bear stood a few paces away, heaving with each breath, her fur streaked with mud and rain. The cub hid behind her, trembling. The ranger gripped the windowsill, torn between relief and sorrow. He could see it all in one frozen tableau. The price of intrusion, the violence born not from cruelty but fear. The bear looked toward him. In her eyes was something deeper than rage, something almost human. She turned away slowly, nudging her cub toward the woods. He could have let her go. He should have. But the hunter's rifle still gleamed in the rain, half loaded. And the bear was limping. She'd been hit. He ran out without thinking, bareheaded, rain slicing across his face. "Wait," he shouted, though he knew she wouldn't understand. The bear turned, defensive, her chest rising and falling in heavy rhythm. He raised his empty hands. "I won't hurt you," he said quietly, stepping closer. The cub whimpered. The mother lowered her head but didn't charge. He saw the wound now. A bullet grazed her shoulder, blood mingling with rainwater. He took off his coat and slowly set it on the ground between them. "You saved my life," he whispered. "Let me help you keep yours." The bear's breath came out in misty bursts, her muscles tensed for fight or flight. But then, miraculously, she stayed still. The ranger tore a strip from his sleeve and pressed it gently against the wound. Steam rose from her fur in the cold. He worked silently, his hands trembling with both fear and reverence. She didn't move. Didn't strike. In that moment, the wilderness and humanity shared one fragile heartbeat. He stepped back when he finished, soaked and shivering. "That's all I can do," he murmured. The bear blinked once, then leaned down, and for the briefest instant, pressed her massive head against his shoulder. It wasn't affection. It wasn't goodbye. It was acknowledgement. Then she turned, gathered her cub close, and disappeared into the dark line of trees. The ranger stood there until the rain stopped. Morning came slow, quiet, golden. The forest smelled of damp earth and renewal. He buried the hunter near the fence, marking the grave with a single stone. There were no words to carve, only the weight of choices left behind. When he returned to the cabin, something new waited by the door. A small, half-chewed branch. He laughed softly, a sound cracked by exhaustion and awe. "You really don't give up, do you?" He picked it up and placed it on the mantel beside the carved figures, man, cub, and bear, the story complete at last. He poured himself tea and sat by the window, watching the treeline shimmer with morning fog. For the first time since his wife's passing, he felt peace. Not the kind born of comfort, but of understanding, that life, in all its forms, asks for the same thing: respect. Weeks later, a rescue team arrived, following the missing hunter's trail. They found the cabin quiet, fire cold, bed neatly made. The ranger was gone. Only the carvings remained, and outside, near the river, a fresh set of tracks, human and bear, side by side for a while, before the human one stopped. Was the ranger right to intervene, or should he have let nature decide its own balance? True coexistence isn't about taming the wild, it's about learning to belong within it. Fear separates species, but empathy binds them in silence.